There is an island in the southwestern Pacific Ocean, north of Australia, off the coast of Papua New Guinea, that most people have never heard of, and that the world's governments have largely agreed to leave alone. It is not large. It is not famous. It does not appear in travel brochures or documentary series about exotic destinations. It appears, when it appears at all, in incident reports and anthropological footnotes and the occasional news story filed after something goes wrong, which it has gone wrong more than once, in ways that ended with people dead. The island is called Kaka, and then there is another place, smaller, more remote, more deliberately sealed off from the modern world, where the last organized attempt at contact by outsiders ended not in handshakes or photographs or the cautious beginning of a relationship, but in 3 funerals. 3 people who went to make contact and did not come back alive. And the question that sits underneath everything we are about to explore is not simply what happened. The question is what it means that places like this still exist. What it means that there are still human communities on this earth that have chosen, or been shaped by circumstance, to remain entirely outside the web of connection that the rest of us call the modern world. What it means that the last true edges of human separation are right here, right now, in our lifetime, on islands and in forests and in valleys that you could theoretically find on a map, that satellites have photographed, that governments have drawn legal boundaries around, and yet that remain, in every meaningful sense, unknown. Subscribe right now if you want to understand the parts of this world that most people never even know to ask about. The places that are real and present and happening, not historical, not theoretical, but alive, right now, today, in ways that will change how you think about what it means to be human. Let us go. To understand what happened on that island, and why it happened, and why it keeps happening in various forms in various places, across the Pacific and the Indian Ocean, and the dense interior forests of South America, you have to start further back than the incident itself. You have to start with the geography. Papua New Guinea is one of the most linguistically and culturally diverse places on the surface of the planet. This is not an exaggeration deployed for dramatic effect. This is a measurable, documented, staggering fact. The island of New Guinea, shared between the Indonesian provinces of Papua and West Papua in the west, and the independent nation of Papua New Guinea in the east, is home to somewhere between 800 and 900 distinct languages. Not dialects of a single language, not regional variations on a common root. Separate, fully distinct, mutually unintelligible languages, many of them spoken by communities of only a few hundred or a few thousand people, many of them unwritten, many of them carrying inside their grammar and vocabulary and the conceptual architecture of their sentences an entire way of understanding the world that exists nowhere else, and that, when the language dies, which many of them are dying, disappears from the human record entirely and forever. The terrain of New Guinea is a large part of why this happened. The island is bisected by a spine of rugged mountains, the Central Highlands, that rise to peaks above 4,000 meters and divide the northern and southern coasts, not just geographically, but climatically, ecologically, and historically. The valleys that cut into these mountains are deep and steep-sided, and in many cases were, until the arrival of aircraft in the 20th century, so difficult to reach from neighboring valleys that the communities living in them developed in effective isolation from each other for thousands of years. Communities separated by a single ridge of mountain might as well have been separated by an ocean for most of human history, because the practical difficulty of crossing that ridge was great enough that contact was rare, trade was limited, and each valley developed its own language, its own customs, its own spiritual practices, its own relationship with the specific plants and animals and landforms of its particular piece of the earth. Then you take that already extraordinary degree of isolation and you extend it to the islands. Papua New Guinea includes not just the eastern half of the main island of New Guinea, but more than 600 smaller islands scattered across the Bismarck archipelago and the Solomon Sea and the Coral Sea. Some of these islands are large and connected to the main island's trade networks and colonial histories. Some of them are tiny and remote, and have been, for practical purposes, on the far side of the world from everyone else for as long as anyone has been keeping records. Karkar Island sits about 70 kilometers north of the mainland coast of Madang Province, in the Bismarck Sea. It is a volcanic island, roughly 25 kilometers in diameter, dominated by a stratovolcano called Karkar Volcano, that rises to about 1,800 meters, and that is emphatically not extinct. Karkar Volcano erupted significantly in 1974 and 1979, and the 1979 eruption is directly relevant to what we need to talk about, because it is what brought the outsiders to the island in the first place, and the outsiders are what set the chain of events in motion. But before we get to the events, we need to understand the island itself. Karkar has been inhabited for a long time. Archaeological evidence suggests human presence going back thousands of years, and the communities that developed on the island before European contact were not isolated in the way that the most extreme cases of Pacific isolation work. Karkar people had contact with mainland communities. They had trading relationships. They had their own canoe traditions and their own patterns of movement across the water. But they also had their own language, Karkar or Waskia, depending on which community you are describing, their own governance structures, their own spiritual and ceremonial life, their own relationship with the volcano that dominated their landscape and that they understood through frameworks of meaning, completely different from those of the volcanologists who would eventually come to study it. And the volcano is an extraordinary presence. Imagine living on an island whose central feature is an active volcanic mountain. Imagine growing up with the knowledge that the ground beneath you is not inert and permanent, but alive in a specific and unpredictable way, that the mountain can and does change what life on your island is like, that the steam and the rumbling and the occasional more dramatic expressions of the volcano's energy are simply a feature of your world, something to be read and interpreted and responded to, not controlled but navigated. The communities of Karkar had been navigating this relationship with the volcano for generations before any outsider arrived to study it scientifically. When European colonialism reached New Guinea in the late 19th century, it came in several competing national flavors. Germany claimed the northeastern portion of the main island and the islands of the Bismarck archipelago, establishing what was called German New Guinea. Britain claimed the southeastern portion. The Dutch had already claimed the western half of the island earlier. This partition, like all colonial partitions, was drawn according to European strategic and economic interests, and bore essentially no relationship to the actual cultural geography of the people living in the territories being divided. Karkar Island fell within the German sphere. The Germans arrived with missionaries and plantation interests, and both had profound and in many cases devastating effects on the communities they encountered. The mission system in particular fundamentally reorganized social life across much of what would become Papua New Guinea, suppressing traditional practices, introducing new religious frameworks, restructuring the relationship between communities and the foreign institutions that now had significant power over their lives. Karkar Island received its share of mission influence in the colonial period, and by the time Papua New Guinea moved toward independence, which it achieved in 1975, the island was in that complicated in-between space that so many Pacific communities found themselves in, partially connected to the modern world, partially shaped by colonial and missionary contact, partially maintaining traditional practices and knowledge systems, trying to navigate between frameworks that were not always compatible. So Karkar Island was not, by the 1970s, an uncontacted island in the most extreme sense of that term. The people of Karkar knew about the outside world. They had been engaged with it, willingly and unwillingly, for decades. But the island's interior, the higher slopes of the volcano itself, was a different matter. And when the volcano began showing serious signs of activity in the mid-1970s, it attracted exactly the kind of outside attention that would prove, in one specific and terrible instance, fatal. The 1978 eruption cycle began building with increased seismic activity and steam emissions from the summit crater. Volcanologists, including a team with connections to Australian research institutions, had been monitoring Kaka for some time, because active volcanoes in populated island settings are exactly the kind of geological hazard that demands monitoring. In January of 1979, two volcanologists, Elias Ravian and a colleague, went up the volcano to assess the situation in the crater. They did not come back. The volcano erupted while they were in or near the summit crater, and they were killed. Their bodies were recovered with great difficulty in the aftermath. This is the incident. This is what the title refers to, though describing it fully requires understanding that calling it a contact incident in the traditional sense is, in some ways, a mischaracterization that itself tells us something important. Because the people who were killed were not killed by islanders who rejected outsider contact. They were killed by the volcano. They were scientists doing exactly what scientists go to active volcanoes to do, and the volcano did what active volcanoes sometimes do to people who are standing too close to them. But the story does not end there, and the truth does not end there. And to understand why this event has been grouped in some accounts with the broader category of dangerous or fatal contact with isolated Pacific communities, we need to understand what was happening not just on Kaka in 1979, but across the entire Pacific world in the decades surrounding that event, and what the concept of fatal contact actually encompasses when you look at it honestly. Because the history of outsider contact with Pacific Island communities is overwhelmingly a history in which the outsiders were the danger, not the islanders, the outsiders. Let us be precise about this. Let us be honest about this in a way that a lot of popular storytelling about dangerous islands and fatal encounters carefully avoids being. When European ships first began moving through the Pacific in the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries, they carried diseases to which Pacific Island communities had no immunity. Smallpox, measles, influenza, tuberculosis. In some island groups, population collapse from introduced disease in the years following initial European contact was 90% or more. 90%. Read that number again and think about what it means. Communities that had been stable and self-sufficient for hundreds or thousands of years lost 9 out of every 10 people within a generation or two of the first European ship making landfall. This happened in Polynesia, it happened in Micronesia, it happened in Melanesia, it happened in the Caribbean. It happened across the Americas. The devastation was so systematic and so total that it is one of the largest demographic catastrophes in recorded human history, and it was inflicted not through warfare or deliberate genocide in most cases, though there was plenty of both, but through the simple biological fact of contact. After the disease came the labor recruiters, often operating through a system called blackbirding that was, despite the euphemistic name, functionally a slave trade. Pacific Islanders were taken, sometimes by outright kidnapping, sometimes through deception, sometimes through arrangements that their communities understood very differently than the recruiters who made them, and transported to work sugar plantations in Queensland, Australia, and Fiji and Samoa and elsewhere. Thousands died in transport or on the plantations. Many more were never returned to their home islands. After the labor recruiters came the formal colonial administration, with its demands for tax payments in cash, that required communities to enter the cash economy, which required working for wages, which required giving up time and energy and land to the colonial enterprise. With its land alienation policies that transferred ownership of island land to colonial governments and private companies in ways that the traditional owners understood completely differently from the legal frameworks being imposed on them, with its restrictions on traditional practices, ceremonies, forms of governance, ways of organizing social life that the colonial authorities found incomprehensible or inconvenient or threatening. This is the context. This is the history. When we talk about isolated island communities that have chosen or been shaped to remain outside contact with the outside world, We are talking about communities whose relationship with that outside world, when they have had one, has been a relationship characterized by catastrophic death tolls, exploitation, dispossession, and the systematic destruction of everything that made their lives coherent. The island communities that have remained most thoroughly isolated from outside contact did not remain isolated because they were incapable of connection. They remained isolated because the connections that were offered to them were, historically speaking, lethal. Now let us talk about the place that most people in the world have actually heard of in this context, because the story of Kaka and the 1979 volcanic deaths is inextricably connected, in the popular imagination and in the broader narrative of isolated Pacific communities, to the much more widely known story of the Sentinelese, the people of North Sentinel Island in the Andaman Sea, because both stories are part of the same larger conversation about what happens at the edge of contact, and because understanding one helps you understand the other. North Sentinel Island is part of the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, a chain of islands in the Bay of Bengal that belongs administratively to India but sits geographically much closer to Myanmar and Indonesia than to the Indian mainland. The island is roughly 60 square kilometers of dense tropical forest surrounded by a reef that makes approach by large vessels difficult, and it is home to the Sentinelese, a community that has maintained perhaps the most absolute and sustained rejection of outside contact of any people on Earth. The Sentinelese population is unknown. Estimates range from a few dozen to a few hundred, and the honest answer is that no one actually knows, because no one has been close enough, long enough, with the right conditions to count. They speak a language that has never been recorded in enough detail to be analyzed. Their social organization, their spiritual practices, their economy, their history, their stories about themselves and their island and their relationship with the world, all of this is unknown to the outside world, because they have not permitted the outside world to get close enough to learn any of it. What is known is this: they live on a densely forested island that has evidently sustained their community for a very long time. They fish in the waters around the island. They appear to gather forest products and hunt. They have been observed by people watching from a careful distance, engaging in activities that suggest a complex and organized social life, ceremonies on the beach, what appear to be funeral practices, construction of structures in the forest visible from the air. They are not, in other words, surviving at bare subsistence level. They are thriving in their specific environment, which they know, with an intimacy that no outsider ever will. And when outsiders approach, they make their preference unmistakably clear. They have shot arrows at helicopters. They have shot arrows at boats. They have shot arrows at the occasional foolhardy individual who attempted to land without invitation. The arrows are effective, and the intent behind them is unambiguous. This is not a misunderstanding. This is a policy, maintained over generations, transmitted somehow through whatever mechanisms the Sentinelese use to transmit important knowledge from one generation to the next. Do not let people land. Do not let people stay. Whatever happened in the past, whatever the Sentinelese know or sense or have in their cultural memory about what contact with outsiders means, they have concluded that it is not something they want, and they are enforcing that conclusion with arrows. India has, to its considerable credit, established a legal exclusion zone around North Sentinel Island that prohibits approaching within 3 nautical miles. Anthropologists and government officials who once made periodic contact attempts, during which gifts of coconuts and metal tools were occasionally accepted before the Sentinelese retreated again, have largely concluded that the most ethical and practical course of action is to leave the island and its people entirely alone, to let them be, to recognize that the choice they have made, or that their circumstances have shaped them to make, is legitimate and deserves respect, even if it permanently forecloses the kind of mutual understanding that contact would theoretically allow. This conclusion was made easier to maintain until November of 2018, when a 26-year-old American man named John Allen Chow attempted to reach North Sentinel Island and make contact with the Sentinelese with the intention of sharing his Christian faith with them. He had been planning the attempt for years. He had entered the exclusion zone illegally, with the assistance of local fishermen who took him to the edge of the reef. He paddled to the island in a kayak. He was killed by the Sentinelese on his third attempt to make landfall. His body was visible from the water for some time, but could not be recovered without putting the recovery team at the same risk he had accepted. The reaction to Chow's death was complicated and revealing. Some people, including his family and members of his religious community, framed him as a martyr, someone who had died bringing the gospel to people who had never heard it. Others, including most anthropologists and many people with any familiarity with the history of missionary contact with isolated peoples, pointed out with considerable force that what Chow had actually done was illegal, that he had violated a law specifically designed to protect the Sentinelese, that his approach had been extraordinarily reckless, not only for his own life, but potentially for the Sentinelese as well, since he carried pathogens to which they have no immunity, and that the entire framework of his mission, the idea that these people needed to be reached and saved, was precisely the framework that had done so much damage to isolated communities across the Pacific and the Americas over the previous 500 years. The Indian government announced that it would not pursue charges against the Sentinelese. This was legally correct and morally obvious, but still notable as an explicit statement from a government that the act of killing someone who enters your island illegally and against all established norms of your community is, in this specific case, understandable and not something the law will treat as a crime. Now we need to go deeper into what is actually happening in Papua New Guinea, because the island geography and the contact history of the Pacific does not tell the whole story of what isolation means in this specific context, and the specific context is worth exploring fully. Papua New Guinea achieved independence from Australia in 1975, and in the decades since independence, the country has been navigating an extraordinarily difficult combination of challenges. A resource-rich but governance-challenged national economy, trying to manage the proceeds of gold and copper and liquefied natural gas extraction, while ensuring that those proceeds reach the communities they come from. A public health system stretched thin across a landscape where hundreds of communities are accessible only by small aircraft or foot travel. An education system trying to function in a context of 800 languages, where the language of instruction, English, or Tok Pisin, the Creole that serves as a national language, is not the first language of most students. A legal system trying to maintain order in a context where the state's actual physical presence in much of the country is minimal, and where traditional governance systems have their own authority and their own logic that does not always align with the national legal framework. And underneath all of this, and running through all of it, the question of what modernization means for communities that had their own complete and functioning ways of life before modernity arrived, and that now find themselves caught between the world their grandparents understood and the world their grandchildren are being educated into. This is not a uniquely Papua New Guinean question. It is one of the central questions of the 21st century, playing out in communities across Africa and South America and Asia and the Pacific. But Papua New Guinea is one of the places where it is playing out with particular intensity and particular complexity, because the degree of pre-existing cultural diversity is so extraordinary, and because the landscape so effectively resisted the homogenizing forces of colonial infrastructure for so long. The Highlands Highway, the main road connecting the coastal cities of Papua New Guinea to the densely populated Central Highlands, was not completed until the 1970s. Before that, the Highlands, home to a significant proportion of the country's population, were accessible from the coast only by aircraft or extremely difficult multi-day walking tracks. The first sustained contact between highland communities and the outside world came in the 1930s, when the Leahy brothers, Australian gold prospectors, and Michael Leahy in particular, who was also a photographer and whose photographs and films are now some of the most important historical documents of first contact anywhere in the world, walked into the Wagi Valley in the Central Highlands and encountered communities that had no knowledge that any world other than their own existed. Think about what that actually means. These were not communities living in primitive ignorance of the larger world. They were communities with sophisticated agricultural systems, elaborate social structures, complex ceremonial and spiritual lives, detailed knowledge of their environment and its resources, languages of great sophistication capable of expressing everything that needed to be expressed in their context. They were fully functioning human communities. They simply did not know that there were other human communities beyond the mountains that bounded their world. And when the Leahy brothers appeared, these men from what must have seemed like another order of reality entirely, the highland communities interpreted them, through the frameworks available to them, as spirits, as ancestors returned, as beings from the realm of the dead. Because what other category was available for something so completely outside any previous experience? The footage the Leahy brothers took, and the footage taken by the communities themselves, who were given cameras and photographed and filmed the contact from their own perspective in a remarkable documentary project conducted decades later, shows something that is both wonderful and heartbreaking. The wonder of genuine first encounter, the absolute novelty on both sides, the curiosity and the careful observation and the cautious reaching toward understanding across an enormous gulf of difference, and the heartbreak, in retrospect, of knowing what came after. The disease, the labor exploitation, the land appropriation, the slow and not always voluntary integration into a world that did not always have the community's interest at heart. The communities of the Papua New Guinean highlands today are neither isolated nor fully integrated. They exist in a complex space where traditional land rights intersect with national law in ways that are constantly being negotiated and contested, where the proceeds of resource extraction on ancestral land should theoretically benefit the communities living on that land, but often do not, or not adequately. Where young people face the choice between staying in their village communities, maintaining their connections to their land and their traditions and their extended family networks, but with limited access to the services and opportunities that the modern economy provides, or moving to the cities, Port Moresby or Lae or Madang, where there is more economic opportunity, but also more violence, more poverty, and a much more radical disconnection from the social and spiritual frameworks that give life in the village its meaning. Port Moresby is regularly listed among the most dangerous cities in the world by various quality of life indices. This is a fact that requires context to understand honestly. The violence that makes Port Moresby dangerous is not random, it is structured. It reflects specific social conditions. The rapid urbanization of a country where urban infrastructure has not kept pace with migration. The collision of hundreds of different community identity systems in a single crowded space, where the Wontok system, the obligation to support and assist members of your own language and community group, which functions as a form of social insurance in village settings, can in urban settings become a mechanism for gang formation and conflict between groups. The limited employment opportunities relative to the population of young men who have come to the city looking for work, the presence of significant mineral wealth in a country where governance institutions are often too weak to ensure that wealth is distributed in ways that reduce rather than exacerbate inequality. All of this is part of the story of Papua New Guinea and its islands, the geography that created extraordinary cultural diversity, the colonial history that imposed external frameworks on communities that had their own, the resource wealth that should theoretically enable prosperity and often does not, the young people navigating between worlds, the villages maintaining their traditions or not, the cities struggling with the consequences of too much change too fast. And out there on the islands, some of them, the people who have made a different choice, or whose choices have been shaped by everything that came before, and who remain, in various degrees, outside. Let us go back to the islands. Let us go to the specific geography that makes this part of the Pacific such an extraordinary place to think about these questions. The Bismarck Archipelago, of which Karkar is a part, includes New Britain, New Ireland, and Manus Island as its largest members, along with hundreds of smaller islands, atolls, and islets. These islands were among the first in the Pacific to experience intensive European contact, because they lie along the maritime routes that European ships used when moving between the Pacific and the Indian Ocean. The island of New Britain was where some of the earliest and most violent encounters between Pacific Islanders and European visitors occurred, encounters that set patterns that would repeat across the Pacific for the next 3 centuries. The islanders, watching ship after ship arrive and either bring disease or take people or make demands that seemed to come from some alien logic, learned quickly that European contact was something to be cautious about or actively resisted. The Europeans, encountering communities that were not eager to trade or assist them in the ways they wanted, often concluded that the islanders were hostile savages who needed to be subdued, rather than that the islanders had perfectly rational reasons for their wariness. This pattern, the misreading of rational caution as irrational hostility, repeated itself across the Pacific with such regularity that it eventually became a standard narrative template: the savage islander, the dangerous beach, the fatal encounter. The template was enormously convenient for the colonial project, because it cast the violence of contact as originating with the islanders rather than with the systems that were being imposed on them. It allowed the colonial authorities to frame their own violence as defensive, their own appropriations as necessary, their own presence as civilizing rather than predatory. The reality was almost always more complicated. The communities that were called hostile had specific histories, specific grievances, specific reasons, grounded in their own experience of what outsider contact had meant. The communities that were called peaceful and welcoming were often in a position of relative powerlessness relative to the technological advantage of the visitors, or were making a tactical calculation that cooperation was safer than resistance, or were being described as welcoming when in fact their gestures were being interpreted through a completely different cultural framework than the one in which they were offered. The study of first contact and its aftermath in the Pacific is one of the most ethically and intellectually complex areas of anthropological inquiry, and it has been transformed over the past several decades by the active participation of Pacific Islander scholars and thinkers who have challenged the frameworks imposed by outsider observers and insisted on the legitimacy and the sophistication of their own communities' perspectives. This is an ongoing transformation, not a completed one. But here is what this history means for the specific question we are exploring. The islands of Papua New Guinea that remain most isolated from outside contact are not isolated by accident or by lack of opportunity. They are isolated because the history of contact in this part of the Pacific gave communities extremely good reasons to be suspicious of outsiders. The communities that are most isolated are, in many cases, communities that made a calculation based on what they could observe of what contact meant, and the calculation was that the risks outweighed the benefits. And now, in the 21st century, those communities are in a strange position. The world around them has changed. The colonial powers have formally withdrawn, though their economic and cultural influence persists in complex ways. The national government that now has formal authority over the territory they live on is led by people who share more of their background and heritage than the previous colonial authorities did. Though the government is distant and its capacity to reach into remote island communities is limited, the world that was dangerous has, in some measurable ways, become less immediately dangerous. But the knowledge of what happened is still there, encoded in community memory, in stories, in the instinct toward caution that communities pass on to their children, not always in explicit language, but in the deep cultural grammar of how to behave when something unfamiliar approaches. There are communities across Papua New Guinea and its islands that are, in the technical anthropological sense, in initial contact or limited contact, meaning they have had some exposure to the outside world, but are not yet fully integrated into the national economy and social system. There are communities in the interior of the main island's Central Highlands where the government's physical presence is essentially a nurse who visits by light aircraft occasionally, and a local school where the teacher may or may not have received adequate training and may or may not be present on any given day. There are communities on small outer islands where the fishing boats of neighboring islands pass by, but where actual sustained contact with the national infrastructure is minimal. These communities are not, in most cases, refusing contact in the way the Sentinelese are refusing it. They are in a different and more ambiguous position, neither fully isolated nor fully connected, navigating a space of partial integration that has its own complexities and its own costs and its own forms of resilience. The resilience is worth pausing on because one of the things that is consistently underestimated by outside observers of isolated or semi-isolated communities is the degree to which those communities are genuinely thriving on their own terms, thriving in the specific sense of sustaining themselves, maintaining their social bonds, transmitting their knowledge and values to the next generation, finding meaning in their lives, living well according to the standards that their own cultural frameworks define as living well. This is not a romanticized or sentimental claim. It is an observation grounded in the actual anthropological evidence about what these communities look like when observed carefully and honestly. Communities that have been growing their own food in the same landscapes for hundreds of generations have a depth of ecological knowledge about those landscapes that no external scientific institution has yet fully documented. The varieties of plants they cultivate, the knowledge of which plants have medicinal properties and how to prepare them, the understanding of seasonal patterns and weather signs and soil conditions and animal behavior, this is not primitive guesswork. This is empirical knowledge accumulated over vast timescales through careful observation and systematic practice. It is, in the truest sense, science without the formal institutional structures and written documentation that Western science uses, but science in the fundamental sense of knowledge, derived from observation and tested against experience and refined over time. The loss of this knowledge, when communities are disrupted or dispersed, or when their younger members are drawn away into the urban economy, is a genuine loss for humanity, not just for the communities themselves. It is a loss of data, a loss of understanding, a loss of perspectives and solutions that the world outside those communities does not have and cannot independently generate. When the last speaker of a language dies, it is not just a human tragedy. It is the permanent deletion of a way of encoding and transmitting knowledge that evolved in response to a specific environment and that carried within it information about that environment that exists nowhere else. This is why the anthropologists and linguists and ethnobotanists who work in places like Papua New Guinea do their work with such urgency, not to study exotic cultures as museum specimens, not to satisfy academic curiosity about people who live differently, but because the knowledge these communities carry is knowledge that the world needs, and that the world is in the process of losing faster than it can be documented. But documentation has its limits. We have been here before, in the Iranian villages we explored, in the Kandavan rock homes and the Masulair rooftop streets. The most powerful form of preservation is not documentation, but habitation, not the record of a way of life, but the living of it. And the communities of Papua New Guinea's outer islands, the communities that remain most isolated from the pressures that are eroding cultural knowledge elsewhere, are, in a profound and complicated sense, doing the most important work. They are living, they are continuing. They are maintaining the practice of specific knowledge in its natural context, which is the only context in which it is fully alive. Now let us talk about what happens when that living is disrupted. Not by volcanic eruptions, though those too, but by the specific modern forms of disruption that are reaching even the most remote Pacific communities. Because isolation in the 21st century is not what isolation was in the 19th century. The world is smaller, the reach of outside forces is longer, and the disruptions are coming in forms that are harder to shoot arrows at than a landing boat. The first and most immediate disruption is climate change. The Pacific Islands are among the most directly and acutely affected places on Earth by the consequences of carbon emissions generated primarily in industrial economies thousands of kilometers away. Sea level rise is already affecting low-lying islands and atolls across the Pacific. Storm intensity is increasing. Coral bleaching events, driven by ocean warming, are damaging the reef systems that form the ecological foundation of much of the Pacific's food production. Freshwater supplies on small islands are being contaminated by saltwater intrusion as sea levels rise. Communities that have been in the same places for generations are being told by scientists and by the evidence of their own observation that they may not be able to remain in those places. For a community on a small island whose entire identity, whose entire spiritual and social framework is oriented around that specific island, the prospect of displacement is not just a practical challenge, it is an existential one. Who are you when the island that made you is gone? What does your knowledge mean when the ecosystem it was adapted to no longer exists? These are not abstract philosophical questions. They are the actual questions being faced by actual communities across the Pacific right now. The second disruption is economic. The global economy reaches into even very remote communities through the demand for resources, fish, timber, minerals, land, and through the lure of cash income that the subsistence economy cannot provide. Young people who want access to education, to healthcare, to the goods and services that the modern economy makes available, find that their traditional communities cannot provide these things, and that to get them they must leave, work for wages, integrate into the market economy. This is not a choice made in conditions of full freedom. It is a choice shaped by the fact that the infrastructure investments that would make it possible to have good healthcare and good education while remaining in a traditional community have not been made and may never be made. The third disruption is communications technology. The mobile phone has reached places that paved roads have not. In Papua New Guinea and across the Pacific, the expansion of mobile networks has brought social media and digital entertainment and the imagery of global consumer culture to communities that were, a decade ago, much more thoroughly insulated from it. This is not simply a matter of young people watching videos. It is a matter of the introduction of a new framework for evaluating what life should look like, what a good life consists of, what success means. The framework that social media carries is, overwhelmingly, the framework of global consumer capitalism, and it is in direct tension with the frameworks of value that have sustained island communities for generations. The anthropologist Wade Davis, who has written and spoken about these questions with great clarity and passion, uses the phrase, the ethnosphere, to describe the sum total of all human cultures, all the different ways of thinking about and organizing and experiencing human life that humanity has generated across its time on Earth. Davis argues persuasively that the loss of cultural diversity is as serious a threat to humanity's long-term capacity for survival and flourishing as the loss of biological diversity, that each culture represents a unique solution to the problem of being human, a solution developed in response to specific conditions and carrying specific insights that no other culture has independently generated, and that when a culture disappears, we lose access to that solution permanently, along with whatever problems it might have helped us solve. This framing puts the question of isolated Pacific communities in a different light. It shifts the question from how do we help these people join the modern world to how do we ensure that the knowledge they carry survives and remains accessible on terms that the communities themselves find acceptable. It shifts the power relationship. It asks the modern world, with its satellite phones and its climate change and its fishing fleets, to reckon with what it is taking as well as what it is offering. The government of Papua New Guinea has, at various times and with varying consistency, taken steps to protect the rights and territories of its most isolated communities. The legal framework around traditional land ownership in Papua New Guinea is, in theory, among the most protective of indigenous land rights in the Pacific, with approximately 97% of land in the country classified as customary land owned by traditional communities rather than by the state or private parties. In practice, the enforcement of these protections against the economic pressure of mining companies, logging companies, and land development schemes has been uneven and often inadequate. Community members who do not understand the legal language of the agreements being put in front of them have signed away rights they did not know they were giving up. Community leaders who understood those rights have sometimes been pressured or bribed into signing anyway. The gap between the formal legal protection and the practical reality is wide and has been a source of ongoing conflict and trauma. There are also communities, and this is important to say clearly, that have chosen integration and found it workable, that have maintained their cultural identities and their community bonds while also engaging with the national economy, sending children to school, using healthcare facilities, participating in political processes. Integration is not inherently destructive. The question is always the terms. The question is always who decides, and with what information, and under what pressures. Integration that is chosen freely, with full information and genuine alternatives, can coexist with cultural vitality. Integration that is coerced by economic necessity or legal manipulation or the simple overwhelming force of larger systems is a different thing. Now let us return to the physical place. Let us go back to the islands. Let us stand on Karkar Island for a moment and look out at the water and think about what this particular piece of the earth has meant and means. Karkar Island today is a relatively accessible part of Papua New Guinea. There is a road around the island, there are mission hospitals and schools, there are commercial coconut and cocoa plantations, some of them going back to the German colonial period. The population of around 100,000 people, the island is more densely inhabited than many parts of Papua New Guinea, lives in communities that range from fairly well connected to the national life of the country to quite isolated in their day-to-day existence, even if not technically uncontacted. The volcano is still active. After the deadly eruptions of the 1970s, monitoring equipment was installed on the island, and the communities living in its shadow have been given evacuation plans and warning systems that, in theory, should allow them to get out ahead of any future major eruptive event. In theory, the practical reality of evacuating a large population from an island with limited transport infrastructure during a volcanic emergency is a different matter, and the communities of Karkar live with the knowledge that the mountain is alive, in the specific sense that it has killed people within living memory. The two volcanologists who died in 1979 were doing dangerous work that they knew was dangerous. Their deaths were not caused by islanders, their deaths were caused by the volcano. But their deaths happened on an island, in a place associated in the Western imagination with a particular kind of danger, the danger of remote and unfamiliar places, and they became part of a broader narrative about the dangers of Papua New Guinea's outer islands that has colored how the outside world thinks about these places. That narrative is worth interrogating, because the actual history of danger in this part of the Pacific is overwhelmingly a history of danger flowing outward from the centers of power toward the margins, not inward from the margins toward the centers. The dangerous parties in the long story of Pacific contact were not the island communities defending themselves. The dangerous parties were the slavers and the disease carriers, and the land appropriators, and the colonial administrators, and the mining companies. The arrows of the Sentinelese are a response to a history of danger. They are not the origin of it. This does not mean that contact between outsiders and isolated communities is never dangerous to the outsiders. It sometimes is, and the people who go to remote places without understanding or respecting the history and the context take real risks. But the framing of isolated communities as inherently dangerous, as places of threat and mystery to be approached with fear, inverts the actual historical relationship between isolation and violence in the Pacific and in most of the world's other regions, where truly isolated communities still exist. The Amazonian communities of Brazil and Peru and Ecuador that remain in voluntary isolation are isolated because the history of contact with the outside world has included massacres, disease outbreaks, land invasion, and the systematic destruction of their ways of life. The communities in the interior forests of New Guinea that remain most isolated from national infrastructure are isolated because the infrastructure that arrives often brings disruption without adequate benefit. The Sentinelese have been shooting arrows at boats for at least 2 centuries, and if you look at what the boats